let me start with Per, reversing the order then. What are your reflections when you hear about the commentaries of what has been to your keynote speeches?
No, I have first of all, I mean, it's an interesting note that really what I see presented as problem from a Swedish base point when it comes to the legal structure concerning the temporal endpoint, and here I spoke both about the question of retrievability, which I think has to be, it's a challenge that has to be taken, and also the question about the transfer of responsibility from the private operator to the state, which I think is the logical step. It has to be, so to say, prepared beforehand. Those problems are very prevalent in Sweden and Finland, but in Finland, on the other hand, we have law about the transfer. I don't know about the, so to say, details about this transfer ownership and so on. In France, which has chosen a different way, neither of these problems is really at hand. Still, you have the problem concerning, so to say, the endpoint. Physical protection has to be in place in a long-term perspective for a French final repository, but the state is already responsible. The type of waste makes the question of retrievability less controversial. On the other hand, one question which comes into my mind after listening to you is, you have all underlined trust as the key issue in the decision-making process. And the key words here are really openness, transparency, inclusion of stakeholders into the decision-making process, the problems of the pedagogic challenges to make this inclusion real and just not a ritual. What you have not mentioned, which I think is something which we have to think a lot about, that is, trust in the decision-making process is one thing. Trust in the regulatory system is another thing which I think is very important. That the concerned stakeholders trust the regulator, trust the modalities for decision-making, surveillance, etc., etc. Because without that trust, I mean, we could have as many open hearings as we want. We would never get trust for the overall structure, operation, anyhow. I just threw the ball back to you in that end.
Before I ask you, could I just make a hang on the trust issue? Because the reflection I made was also that in my, this is a very journalistic approach, as always, we always are dichotomic and think of opposites. But in my work, politicians say, trust me, and scientists say, prove me wrong, falsibility. So they don't say, trust me, they say, this is the science, if you wish to prove me wrong, go ahead, make another experiment and let's see, and you are welcome, because this is a hypothesis. So falsibility, and while trust is a political issue. Now suddenly, trust is mixed up in a way of believing also. Let's believe in the scientists, which is, now of course, this is a very, very simple picture and a bit nasty approach from my side, but just in order to get it right, why should we trust you? Because we want proofs, we do not wish to have trust. On the other hand, all our political system and representative democracy, on the long run, is also based on trust. We trust our representatives, that's why we have chosen them, and because we trust them to guard our not only views, but also our interests. Let's keep that in mind and get back to the issue that you mentioned, Pierre-Benoît, about decision-making and social processes that are, or decision-making processes that are getting more and more complex, and the participatory part of the decision-making process. What are your reflections when you listen to the French, the Finnish, and the Swedish models in that sense?
Well, I think that from a social science perspective, the differences between the countries are very interesting. The fact that the speakers do not, well, when they try to say who is the first, it's a time issue, it's not a value judgment on what is the best system, because they are aware of the basic differences, which are technical on one side, on one hand, but which are also political on the other hand. And actually, we have very, very different situation in relation to the relation between the citizen and the state. It is very much embedded in the political culture, but also between local and national policy responsibles. So there are so many differences that the first reaction is to say, okay, let's go and see in details what is occurring. And the lessons that may be exchanged between countries are not that obvious because of these differences. There are, however, some general trends, and Claes just said that we experience in all the countries more and more complexities in the way to handle these processes. And whether we like it or not, it is a fact. It's not. We do not have the choice. When Rudy says we shift from progress society to risk society, it's not a value judgment. It's an observation of some major transformations which affect those countries in different ways. So this is the issue, and actually we can say that there is a positive normative judgment on participation, and it is one of the arguments of Fiorino, which the normative value of participation. Participation enhances democratic process because it is important for citizenship and so on and so forth. Actually, there is also an instrumental dimension. It does not mean that it will be easier and that it will be faster. Actually, it may be slower. The issue is to have robust processes, and actually, the society, and we can discuss the use of precautionary principle and other side consideration related to the issue. But yes, I think that we are in times where there is a sense of urgency, but where, for many reasons, my guess is that the social processes will be slower because there is time of maturation, discussion, public debate, and so on and so forth, and because we are in societies where the decision process is much more distributed than it was. And it is very much related to issues related to neoliberalism and so on. It's not only some consideration related to democratization, it is also related to the fading role of the state in many areas, which is a type of reality we have to face, even though in France, till now, it is the state which is responsible. But before Fukushima, we had some discussion even on this issue, on the balance of responsibilities, which might have changed a bit before Fukushima.
But it's fairly obvious that when you refer to the shift in governance from technological to democratic governance, you have maybe the French experience in mind, but it's definitely applicable also in Finland and Sweden, although I agree with Klaus in the sense that there are important differences in the Finnish and the Swedish ways of decisions making, also maybe nuances that we see better here in Scandinavia, but definitely who influence how the processes are conducted. Any reflections from you concerning what has been said? Yes, please.
At least I could, when I stress the importance of trust, it boils down, of course, that the safety comes first. In our work, we have to assess what we do and what we're aiming at achieving. It has to be safe. And everything which we put forward to our license application or present to our regulators or the society, it has to be done so that it really can be looked through by anybody. So that, and this has become harder and harder, that the arguments we put forward that our system is safe, the evidence we are collecting and reporting and putting available to anybody who wants to see them is really hard work. And like Klaas said, this probably was not the case maybe 30 years ago, 35 years ago, so everything was much smoother and the decision-making kind of process was a bit different. But as we have developed a kind of safety culture in companies who are responsible in Sweden and Finland for this, but also the regulator. So the regulator has to be the body who actually can say that this is now safe and convince the decision makers. And that's why I mentioned that regulators today want more and earlier. And there is a very good evidence on that because there's a new reactor being built at Olkiluoto. We see the developments, how they have been. And the same is what we actually see in our work. So this is definitely the case, that because nothing else really matters than safety. So at least to us. So of course there are some economic standpoints and views, but these are less than that this has to be safe. And we really cannot assess the safety by conducting some experiment, but we have to just base that on scientific and technical information, and that has to be reliable.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Briefly, I should say, because there are some people asking from the audience as well.
Just a few words about trust. I think, in our experience, the most important thing in building trust is that you, by your action, show that you do what you plan to do, you follow what you say, and I think one of the most important actions in our case to get trust in the siting process, when we started that in the beginning of the 90s, was that we had feasibility studies in the north in 2 municipalities. After they were finished, there was a local referendum with the results saying that the population didn't want us to continue. We wanted to continue. And what happened was that we followed what we had said. In case we don't get the trust needed locally, we will leave these municipalities, and we did. That was much more important than any statements we were able to do before that. In the same way, if we have an experiment in our facilities, and if for some reason data quality and so on, data control is not done in the way it should be, the trust will be shaken. So action and trust goes very strongly together.
That's interesting. It's actually a bit more different than how some of the Swedish politicians during the 19th, 20th century has reacted to some referendums. Not at least the one 57 who said we do not wish to have traffic on the right side of the road.
I agree. The Swedish national referendum are not a good example.
So in any case, please, I think we have at least one person. Yes.